Hi, I'm Chris from airwindows, and this time I don't have all kinds of fancy spectrum analyzers and stuff on the screen because this plugin is just about the sound. Mind you, you could still measure the spectrum analyzers and stuff of it, but here's density. Density is another very early plugin, and it's using some of the basic building blocks that many airwindows plugins have been built on. It's using a kind of saturation that's based on the simplest, most continuous saturation curve you can have. And you can use it in two different ways. You can turn it up to this 4.0 setting, which kicks in other stages and makes it become more extreme, or you can turn it down. And that's not something that I usually see. I had to build this because I was doing stuff like that with a plugin called Cyanide and found that there was some things going on with it that I wanted to do my own version of it. Here's kind of what it sounds like. And then again, we got an output level and a dry and wet. You'll see what that's about later. There's a special reason for it. We'll turn it down because we're going to demonstrate the high density. So we can see it's getting a little more intense. And then you can make it even more intense than that. Oh, but wait, there's more. Don't ask me why I found this necessary. It's a pretty irritating sound, really, but kind of strange. But that's not really the point of density. That's just making the range of it go to the ridiculous. The point of density is more about taking music and sound and getting this sort of warm saturation such as you're hearing here. Now that's already pretty saturated, so let's go to something that's maybe not as saturated as that. We've got this, and if we saturate this, notice how it's coming forward? Especially between 0 and 1 here, where it's just one stage. You can plainly see that there's another stage here. It comes forward, not just saturating, not just getting louder, but backward, forward. Now this is a pretty big insight as far as being able to sculpt sound and place it where I want in the sound stage. But you'll notice there's not just the positive values of density. It goes forward when you go to the positive values, but note what happens when you go to the negative values. Thins out, gets quieter, even to a ridiculous extent. And that's a pretty strange, unlikable sound here. It's exaggerated. It allows you to go to these unreasonable positions. And of course you got your dry wet if you want to just use it to enhance. But forward, backward. Also tends to try to make the reverb vanish away a little bit too. Here's where this gets more interesting. The high pass does not also affect dry wet. So imagine if we've got, say, Alien Kittens here. And we want to make that, in EDM you call that a bass. Doesn't sound much like a bass to me, but that kind of thing. Maybe we want to make that rasp and roar a little bit more, but we still want the extreme lows in there. One of the things we can do is throw in the high pass so that it does what the high pass does. But then we put the dry wet in as well. Let's hear what we get here. And we might want to turn output level down as well, just so that we're focusing on the overload equality at the volume level we want it. So I'll take that away. Leave that snarl in there. And then push it until it's breaking up. Also, I should point out, density is happening after this high pass. Check this out. It's grunging right out here, but we can clean it up a little bit. And then we bring it back into lows with dry wet. So now what we have is a plugin where we can dial in this crazy grind on whatever and then bleed in a little bit of it at the level that we want. Or we can push this up a little bit, seeing as it's going to be mostly dry. Let's use this to just sort of boost and use this to sort of hype things up a little bit. This is the kind of thing density can do when used in this context. Turning it off. So a lot less exciting. And then exaggerated. That has this whole distorty, exaggerated quality to it. Because this is what it's working from. And you combine a little bit of that with dry, and it has a whole savagery going on. And then supposing it's just a little bit too dirty still, we can use the high pass to clean up the low mids. And again, it brings sounds forward because it's distorting them. The saturation effect of this kind then back, and then forward. And then we can pull this back so that it's a lot cleaner, but still we're getting the same effect. This is without. I've used this on all kinds of things. For instance, if you have a bass guitar, and I know people don't necessarily like to do what I do with bass guitars. I tend to make the bass guitars very MIDI and aggressive because I grew up listening to Yes and Chris Squire. Oh, so I always want them to be a little raspier, but you can get a lot of definition out of a bass guitar by turning up the upper mids with density or something like it, and using the high pass to keep it from just grinding the bass, grinding the lows too much, and then using the dry wet to combine it with the basic sound. And to finish up, I will show how that effect sounds on a rock mix like this, which I'll do in the usual way of just dialing in what I've got here. Oh, careful, that's set it to -1. That would sound like this. Perhaps not so useful. Although, I say not useful, but bear in mind that this track is very distorted. It sounds like this. Everything's all distorted and too loud. What if I set the high pass right down to 0 and the density to -1 like that? All of a sudden I've got nothing but a bunch of attacks. And then I can also, so I hear it grinding in the lows a little bit. I can clean it up like this. I'm listening to how it hits the kick drum. I want it to have a sort of flapping quality, but not too intense. And then what we do is just sneak it off of the lowest quantities until I have a simulation of a clean sound. And that's all edge, and that's also missing the extreme lows. And then what I can do is crank this right up, go to the all dry, and start blending in a little bit of the wet, and try to resist the just oversaturatedness of this by taking it part of the way to this. I clearly have to pull that back a little bit because it was cluttered. So that's kind of interesting. What I'm doing here is I'm using highs in here, but I'm tending to make them mostly transients, mostly the attacks of things. And I'm allowing the lows to come in through the dry only. Compare this very loud and driving with it's as if it was cleaned up, sort of unsaturated, unclipped a little bit. Now this is not necessarily what you're going to want to do because that's kind of out of fashion. People like clipped and as overloaded as possible. But you don't have to go all the way to something like that. We can just have a little bit. Let's make this very aggressive, very sort of guitar ampy bass sit back in the mix a little bit and bring out more of the cymbals and things like this. that right back. And that's an interesting that's almost a mastering behavior here, because what we're doing is we're allowing the sound to behave itself in a different way. It's not just all rowdy and overloaded. Instead, you turn this on, and the whole thing is kind of more lows, more broad range. And it's all through combining these settings, using the dry for the main part, and then setting up the right balance of this, and using it to define the shape of the sound. But of course, we can't just only do that. We've got to hear what it would sound like to just make it even louder and more roaring, in case you're like Iggy Pop or something, and that's just how you roll. Let's demonstrate that a little bit too. It starts with this. Now let's have just the upper grind of that stuff. Not that much at lower mids though. We want it to be good and raspy. Here's how we make loud. All right, enough of that. Density is, as you can see, very flexible. This is one of those plugins where you kind of will just have to learn how to use it. It comes with the output level and dry wet control already built in from the start. It was like that in 2007 and it still is. And again, it's a very simple plugin. Inside, there's not all that much going on with it, but the range of things you can do with it is pretty outlandish. And I feel pretty sure that you're going to like it. So have fun.